Hey guys, this is Module 2, Lecture 1, about population and the environment. So the question I guess we're examining today is this adorable little person the environment's number one enemy? It's a contentious issue, it has been for a long time, and there's a lot of misconceptions out there. So let's see what we can do to clear those up. I wanted to summarize, actually, and tell you sort of the bottom line before I get there, because I'm not always sure. It's kind of a complex topic. I'm not always sure whether I am going to get there. I will eventually, but it takes a while. But the bottom line message is, one, some people see population growth as, again, the number one environmental problem. Number two, consumption, though, my number two here is that consumption is how much stuff are we all using, buying, using, throwing away, etc. A lot of people argue that consumption is actually a bigger issue, and that in any case population growth is actually slowing down dramatically, which is true. And if we want to see it slow down even more, the best way to do that is to make positive social changes. So what do we mean by that? I'll get to it. But as I said, this is a really contentious issue that's been around for a long time. And if you ask the question, what is the best news for the environment in the last 50, 60 years or so, from the time when people were publishing books like The Population Bomb, which is going to destroy the planet and the global ecology and human beings and everything that we know, etc. What's changed since then? At the time, late 60s, early 70s, sort of the dawning of the modern environmental era, people predicted with great confidence that population growth would be the, basically ecological, planetary, human destruction. And what's happened in the meantime, actually, is not quite what was predicted. In fact, what it's looking like now was actually just around the time that books like The Population Bomb were published, the rate of growth of human population actually dramatically started declining from about 2.1% in 1968 down to, let's see, what would this be? Less than half of that by in recent years. And the population growth is actually expected to stabilize sometime in this century, possibly by the middle of the century and certainly by the end of the century. So that's gigantic good news, no question about it. And if you think of it in terms of not the rate of growth, but the number of people being added to the planet, what you see is these are actually pretty conservative numbers here, that by about 2080, 2090, we'll get to zero people being added, net numbers, that is births minus deaths. That deaths will actually possibly outpace births, and the world's population will begin to decline sometime in the second half of the current century. So that's great news in terms of, if you're concerned about population growth and you think it is an environmental problem, well, it's a lot less of an environmental problem now, and it's going to become less for sure. We know that from demographic data, which are pretty robust. So why is that? Well, again, it's just about as simple as you can get. It's math that even I can handle. It's just births minus deaths is the rate of growth of the world's population. So obviously, when births exceed deaths, then population grows. When deaths exceed births, then population declines. And the death rate really hasn't changed much in recent years. It went down, it went up a bit in the COVID period. It's probably stabilized again now. The US is a very odd country for a developed country. Death rates have gone up a little bit, but mostly they're actually stable. What's really changed is birth rates, and these data here, this graphic here, should be the best news that you've ever seen in a graphic on a computer. Which basically what this is, excuse me, this is called the fertility rate, which is just a demographic measure of the number of children that the average woman has in her lifetime. As you see from, this is globally, from the middle of the 20th century to the present, the fertility rate has dropped from 5 down to about 2.3 something around here, which is, it's dropped more than half. That's gigantic good news, and if that trend continues, almost certainly we'll get to 2.1, which is what's called replacement level fertility, which the 0.1 is just a statistical measure of the number of children who don't survive until adulthood. So if you get to 2.1, then the population has to eventually stabilize, and so that is really great news. Actually, I'm going to go to this graphic, this text here first, and mention that the growth rates are declining less in the developed countries because growth rates already dropped, and where we're seeing actually the most decline is in the developing regions. Those, places like China, which India just replaced China as the world's largest population, which means that China's birth rate has dropped really significantly. So what we see is a world where every place is seeing declining fertility rates, but most dramatically in the less developed countries, again, only because the more developed countries, the wealthier countries, already saw that decline earlier. And what's really, really encouraging about this is that it's happening in every region. Europe, North America, Latin America, Asia, and even Africa, which has been sort of a demographic outlier for a long time, was considered to be sort of where a lot of the world population growth was likely to be happening. And so you're seeing that same decline even in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa in particular, which is just fantastically great news from a demographic and ecological human perspective in just so many ways. And what's amazing about it is it's happening in places that you really wouldn't expect it. This is a graphic of Bangladesh. From, again, the middle of the 20th century to the present, you saw a decline from 6 to about 2. And so, that means population's basically stabilized in Bangladesh, which is really exceptional because Bangladesh is a very poor country. And so if Bangladesh can do it, pretty much any place, I think, can do it. And part of the story, a big part of the story here, is that Bangladesh went out of its way to try to encourage smaller family sizes. So it wasn't just an accident. You're also seeing this in various places in sub-Saharan Africa, including, for example, Botswana here below 3 children per woman in her lifetime. So that's really a remarkably good news. And this overall pattern of decline is just, what you want to see. And in terms of global scale, again, replacement level fertility is 2.1. That is likely to be achieved, according to this graphic, by, let's say, 2070, something like that. So that's, again, sometime in the middle of, the second half of the 21st century, we're going to see that the world's population stabilized. Now, at exactly what level, we don't know. Some of the more conservative projections estimate it might be 10.4 billion. Some projections actually think that it's going to be more like 9 or even 8 billion. We're currently at just over 8 billion. And so, it depends a lot on what happens in terms of fertility rate, and we'll come back to that. What actually makes the difference in terms of declining fertility rates. But we know that at some point in the second half of the 21st century, population is going to stabilize. At, again, exactly what number we don't know for sure. And again, this is just a graphic showing that most of that increase is going to happen of the continued increase is going to happen in Asia and Africa, with the portion that's happening in Asia declining, and that's largely because of growth rates, fertility rates declining in China in particular, but other Asian countries as well. So you see, in most of the world, population is pretty darn either stable or declining, and that's really great news. These are graphics of population projections for the United States, France, Italy, Japan, and what you can see in all of these cases is that population growth is, population is pretty much stable. In the US and France in this example. Wait a minute, is that right? Yeah, France. Just very, very small increases. Italy and Japan both seeing decreases in population, and that is happening in much of the world as well. So again, if you're concerned about population growth for environmental reasons or other reasons, that's, things seem to be going in the direction that we want them to go, right? But why is it, back up, getting ahead of my slides, but why is it that some countries are still seeing a lot of population growth? Well, it has to do with something that demographers call the demographic transition. And in this graphic, what you see is from over time, and this is a model of demographic change that we've seen over and over again in various parts of the world. What you see, and it happened first in Great Britain and Western Europe, but then it happened in North America and parts of Latin America as well, Asia, parts of Asia as well, Japan in particular. What you saw was that as countries became more economically and socially advanced, people had more nutrition, better education, better hygiene, but better public health, health services, and so on. What we saw was the death rates began to decrease dramatically. And because of sort of cultural and social reasons, people's choice was still to have relatively large family sizes, but then they realized that, well, hey, if we're going and working in an office instead of working on the farm, it doesn't make a ton of sense to have 8 children or whatever. So they started having smaller family sizes as societies industrialized, and so eventually the decline in birth rates catches up with the decline in death rates, and you get to a position of population stabilization. And what's happening in the less developed countries right now is that they're actually passing through this stage, going from a high mortality, high fertility regime, lots of children being born, unfortunately lots of children dying, and so on, to a condition where you have fewer children being born, but also a lot more surviving, and with population stabilized. There's two kinds of population stability: high fertility, high mortality, or low fertility, low mortality, and obviously you want the latter and not the former. But in the process of that transition, there's a period when populations grow a lot. And what we know is that the European societies, North America, Japan, etc., went through that process, and other societies almost assuredly will go through the same process. How fast and is a key question, right? And that question of how fast and how much fertility drops is a really key question in terms of population projections. Depending on what sort of projections you have, sort of optimistic projections where you end up with a growth pattern that actually a population change pattern that actually results in declining populations by the end of the 21st century, or continued high rates of population growth, depends on what happens with fertility rates. So small differences in fertility lead to really different sorts of outcomes in terms of population. And high fertility is, remember when I talked about people writing books in the late 1960s about the population bomb and so on, it was kind of assumed that fertility was just kind of baked into human nature. People had a certain number of children, it was just, biological or whatever, and that wouldn't change much. It turns out that's not true at all. It turns out that as social conditions change, people tend to have a lot fewer children. As people move from rural agricultural societies into urban and industrial societies without really doing anything, no coercion, population control needed. You see transitions to much smaller family sizes, right? It turns out, those assumptions about fertility rates being kind of stuck and unchangeable were just plain wrong. The key question is, what sorts of social conditions enable people to make choices to have smaller family sizes? One thing I want to mention here that's really important is that, again, back in the 1960s and 70s, people were talking about a lot about population control, and you still hear that in some environmentalist circles. We need to have population control. I'm kind of like, well, have you not actually read the demographic data for the last 60 years or so? Because for one thing, the trends are already going the way you want them to go. So whatever it is that's working, and we'll get to that in a minute, we should do more of that. And it turns out that some countries were so alarmed, India is a prominent example, some countries were so alarmed that they used coercive population control, forced both women and men actually to have be involuntarily sterilized, which was it was brutal. It resulted in all kinds of human rights abuses and so on, and it didn't work. India today has the world's biggest population and is growing among the fastest countries in the world. So what happens? That begs the question of what works, what really matters in terms of affecting people's choices about how many children to have. The answer is things like economic security. If people live in largely agricultural societies, more little hands means more people to work on the farm. Or if the only source of jobs in your community is working in this case on a tobacco plantation in Indonesia, and you have a lot of kids and they're not going to school because they can't afford school fees or uniforms or whatever it is, they can go work on the plantation and make some money and bring it home. Turns out the little hands actually are really good at doing things like picking and sorting tobacco and so on. In certain kinds of less developed economies, it just makes a lot of sense for families to have large numbers of children. But those are typically conditions when people live in poverty with very little economic security and so on. So when people get jobs, wage labor jobs where they're protected by laws and unions and so on, and they have more economic security, they have a lot fewer children. That's just been shown over and over. And things like healthcare. You would think that, well, if you have more healthcare and more children survive to adulthood, then you would actually have a larger population. It turns out that it's exactly the opposite. That if you give people adequate healthcare, the parents choose to have smaller family sizes, knowing that a larger number of children will survive to adulthood. So if children have inoculations, access to prenatal care, postnatal, nutrition programs, and so on, that enable families to make sure their children survive, they'll have smaller family sizes. Because it's kind of grim to say this, but families in many societies where they don't think the children will survive will have sort of a larger number, knowing that, and in a sense, sort of overcompensating. Education is overwhelmingly the most strongly correlated factor with smaller family sizes. I won't go through this whole table, but it's just an interesting example in Ethiopia. At this top chart here, what you see is that girls in this case who have access to education, or let's look at this one first, girls who do not have a secondary or higher education level, secondary school or higher education level, have about 6.1, this is a little bit out of date data, but about 6.1 children, compared to girls who do have a secondary school or higher education have about 2 children. So a factor of 3, that's a huge difference. Why does that make sense? Well, if women have opportunities, can go out into the workforce and be autonomous, lead their own lives, make their own decisions through education, then they tend to have a lot smaller family sizes. It makes sense, right? And culture, things like, in this case, age at marriage. In places like Niger and West Africa, what you see is that the typical or average age at marriage is about 17 years, something like that, compared to Sweden, where it's, let's see, where are we, 2017. So these are a little bit out of date data, but Sweden compared to Niger, is, let's see, average age at birth in Sweden is, looks like roughly 35. And you can just think about that for a minute and think about, okay, well, if, sort of the window of childbearing years is up to, the early or mid 40s, then Swedish women will have a much narrower sort of period when they are likely to be having children after marriage, and that results in smaller family sizes. And sure enough, that's exactly what happens. And so culture is really important. Things like when girls are expected to be married make a really big difference. And what we see time and time again is that in patriarchal societies where girls don't get to choose their age at marriage, you see larger family sizes. Where girls do have autonomy, where patriarchal cultures aren't dominant, girls will choose typically to have smaller family sizes than their male partners. We've seen that all over the world. So women's autonomy and empowerment as parts of culture are a really key part of the story of declining fertility rates. Let me sum this up. In 1982, a demographer named John Caldwell sort of formalized what I was just talking about under what he referred to as wealth flows theory. And what that means is that it's basically sort of a cost-benefit analysis that you do about having children. It's basically if children cost the parents more, then they'll have fewer children. It's sort of, you kind of hate to think of children as an economic asset, but it's the reality that parents anywhere have to face. Whereas if children, I mentioned, showed you the example of girls working on a tobacco plantation in Indonesia. If those children provide more money sort of flowing upward from the children to the parents, then the children are an economic asset, and the parents go, yeah, we want more children. I mean, you hate to think of it in those terms, but people do think in terms of sort of the economics of how many children to have. It's just, it's unavoidable. Gender equality, which I just talked about, women's autonomy, allowing later age of birth, allowing girls to choose to be married at later ages and so on. Educational opportunities and income and employment. Urbanization is a key factor. If you live in a crowded city and space is scarce, if you had a family of 8, where are you going to put them? That becomes, those sorts of practical questions become real decisive variables in terms of fertility. Survival and healthcare that I talked about before. Old age security, something I didn't talk so much about, but in a lot of societies where parents don't have a retirement plan or social security income, those sorts of social institutions for old age, the only source of support that they have in old age is their own children. And so if you provide social security and retirement benefits and so on for older adults, they'll say, hey, we don't have to sort of invest in our 401k children plan of having like 8 children. They say, hey, we'll be okay in old age. We don't need to have that many children. One last thing I want to add here, which is the role of contraceptives, which has been very sort of contentious over the years. And it is part of the story. There is such a thing as, an accidental child, births that weren't intended, more than the parents wanted. But for the most part, what demographers find is that families have the number of children that they intend to have. They have the number of children that they want, give or take, right? And so contraceptives can be a valuable part of family planning efforts, but the key thing is the family has to want to have a smaller family size, or they're not going to use the contraceptives. And I've worked in the past a lot in places like sub-Saharan Africa, where people are just not particularly interested, to the great frustration of outside development organizations often not particularly interested in contraceptives because they, the social conditions, education, gender equality, etc., that enable people to want to have smaller family sizes aren't in place in some of those societies. So again, contraceptives can be helpful, but are not the key factors, frankly, in terms of fertility decline. Again, the social conditions have to be in place to make families want to have smaller numbers of children in the household. So in terms of thinking about proximate and root causes that we talked about last week, if you ask the question, well, where does population growth even come from? Well, we just talked about it comes from poverty, it comes from gender inequality, it comes from lack of adequate health care, it comes from old age insecurity, lack of education and job opportunities, and so on. And if you flip that around and ask the question of what are the root causes of population stabilization, population stability, well, they're the flip side of those. You don't need population control if what you have is you have contraceptives, but most importantly, you have development, gender equality, health and education, healthcare and systems that help children to survive to adulthood, old age security, education, and job opportunities. If those things exist, then families will use the contraceptives and want to have smaller family sizes. It's just been shown over and over again. So to achieve population stability, you ought to do what works. We know these things work. Gender equality, educational and job opportunities, especially for girls and young women, healthcare, and so on. Those things work. They make the difference. That's why those graphs are trending down the way we want to see them. For example, childhood mortality has been declining consistently for decades now. That is just great news. When more children survive, families make the choice to have smaller numbers of children.